Dr. Priscilla Johnson. She was the former Microsoft director of water strategy, and is now a principal of Priska Consulting. She's a Purdue Boilermaker by way of NYU and the University of Konstanz, and you can explain that maybe in the native language. Priscilla has done a few things, and at significant scale. She brought a new data center online in South Africa during the post-Day Zero drought period, and coordinated a water-saving project across 52 hospitals in the Western Cape, which created over 170,000 direct and indirect jobs, which might warrant a little explanation. And then, of course, another interesting thing is that she holds a patent for a data center core, shell, and airflow design that improves heat transfer and reduces energy consumption. So she's here to talk to us about AI and cybersecurity, data centers, and water, all that mix. Welcome to Waterpalooza, and take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Dennis. It's delightful to be here with all the participants. I do have something that I want to share in terms of a slide, so I've sent a request. And in the interim, yes, that was one of the proudest moments that I had working in Microsoft's data centers as the director of water strategy, working to combat a drought. It was a significant drought, 3 years. And it was a very significant drought for 3 years. And they had a reservoir that was quickly dwindling. It was to serve only 2 million people initially, but there are now over 8 million people in the greater Cape Town area. And they were facing a drought, a historic one, that their reservoir was not being replenished. And Microsoft at the same time wanted to bring Africa Hyperscale online. And it was the first of the hyperscalers to want to do that in that area, and they did not have the water. So what I did was I assembled a team, and I'm making it sound very simple. It was very complicated, but I assembled a team to deliver air-to-water generators to that site to generate water and also share it with the community, because that's a really big principle that I have is, when you have more than plenty, then you share, so that we can make our neighbors more resilient in the event of the next drought. So that was very measurable. And yes, I do have a patent on a waterless data center that uses less energy. And I have not seen it being built yet, but I certainly hope in the future that it will be. And yes, and so now I am the managing principal partner of Priska Consulting. And what I want to share with you all today is a walk through how much water data centers actually use, the traditional ones. I also want to talk about how much water the AI data centers use. I know there's been a lot of controversy and talk about that. And then I also want to talk to you about something that you may not typically hear on a regular basis, which is the cyber threats from a cybersecurity standpoint and cyber intelligence standpoint. I'm finishing up actually a certificate tomorrow from James Madison University in cyber intelligence, and have learned quite a bit about the national threats to our critical infrastructure, and have since started hosting workshops for our deputy regional directors, for example, from the Bureau of Reclamation, on simulated cyber attacks of the Hoover Dam. So large critical infrastructure and threats, and actual IT threats, as well as the intelligence threats. So I am getting ready to share my screen. All right, asking for a lot of permission, so I hope you all can see the first screen, which is a screen where I just introduced the concepts of what we'll be talking about. And it's a lot of subjects, I understand. So I'm just going to walk very slowly through this, and then I'll entertain some questions at the end. So there's one component we're talking about today, which is water, and then we're talking about the technology components on the other hand, and what is being demanded of a natural resource that is typically considered a public right. It is also by the Pope, he considers it a human right. And it is also to the detriment, I think, of all of us considered something that is cheap. And that, from a technological standpoint, I think that has led us to these very large problems that we're facing with the battle between technology, national security, data centers, and a natural resource such as water. So this is one question that has been answered a lot more in different ways in the press recently about how much water traditional data centers really use. And I can tell you that some of the numbers are correct, but most of them aren't. So I'm just using my operational knowledge of the data centers, the hyperscale data centers that I was involved in. And it is typically about, in your largest data centers, about 50 million gallons of water per year that is being used. And why is it being used? It's being used for cooling data center servers. And as you can imagine, all of the things that are connected to the internet have to be somehow served from a server. Delivering zeros and ones actually produces a lot of heat and requires water sometimes in data centers that use this type of cooling, what we call adiabatic or evaporative cooling, which predominantly relies on a large flow of water for that center. And just one data center can use this. Just one data center can use 50 million gallons of water. And so the question becomes, what happens when you have a lot of data centers that are co-located in one area? And that is typically more and more the case of these hyperscalers, where you'll see a Meta, you'll see an AWS, you'll see a Microsoft, a Google, all located in the same area, actually, because the conditions are right for them. There's free, not free, but cheap energy or cheaper energy. There's access to that cheap energy, and there's also access to water. So they're all competing over these resources that are finite. So these multiple data centers can actually take a toll on a watershed, depending upon where you are, and in particular in a water-stressed one. Now, here's the question I think everyone really wants to know is, how much water do AI data centers require? And is it different than what traditional data centers require? So I will answer the question from the standpoint of the first piece of news that you all are probably aware of is that Microsoft, for example, wants to restart one of the units on 3 Mile Island. And why is this significant? This is significant because this data center, and I'll explain a little bit later on what the driver, our main driver is behind this, is an AI-based data center. So it's delivering things to us, like, for example, Copilot is their AI product. ChatGPT is OpenAI's product, their AI product. Gemini is Google's AI product, et cetera. And all of these data centers are requiring a lot more intense calculations to get to an answer that a prompt might require. So you go onto a prompt on ChatGPT or onto Gemini or onto Claude or any of those AI, and it does require more energy. It does require more water to deliver that answer back to you. So that's why water is at the center of data centers and their usage, and especially in water-stressed areas. So what does this mean for an AI data center? So typically, your largest data center in the world that is being contemplated and actually being built now is an energy demand of 1 gigawatt. And till now, that has been something that people have charted for maybe 5-10 years out. What has accelerated the need for a data center that requires this level of energy compared to a typical data center that from the smallest data center, you might require 10 megawatts in terms of a demand to a more hyperscale data center that might be looking at 50 megawatts, 40 megawatts. Now what we're talking about is an entire order of magnitude, 1,000 times what we are typically using from an energy demand perspective, 1,000 times that, which is 1 gigawatt. So this is the equivalent now of a nuclear power plant that is, currently online. The ones that you typically see with the typical cooling towers, those sort of cylindrical molded towers. That's one nuclear power plant, and that is 1 gigawatt. Or it could be 3 smaller, what they call modular reactors, and they're both powered from the same source, which is nuclear, which is uranium. So what are we asking for from our water perspective? How much water is really being required? So these numbers, I think back when I calculated these, I didn't really think they were correct. And then I went back and I said, no, this is correct, based upon all that I know and all that is required. In particular, you know that nuclear power also demands water as well in order to cool the rods and also create steam, which powers the turbines, which produces the energy. So inherently, the technology now for nuclear, for both the small modular reactors as well as the nuclear reactors that we've seen traditionally, like the ones on 3 Mile Island, they need 6 million gallons of water per megawatt of the energy that is actually produced. So those standalone traditional nuclear power plants are requiring that just to keep the power plant going, not the data center, the power plant. So if OpenAI, for example, and it has expressed interest in developing a 5 gigawatt data center, if they wanted a 5 gigawatt data center as of today with the current technology, they would be consuming about 6 billion gallons of water per data center per year. So I just want to let that sink in. 6 billion gallons of water per data center is 1,000 times more than what one data center would require. That's 1 megawatt, for example. So we're talking orders of magnitude difference, not just in the power, but in the water itself. So I'm going to get to why there's been, it seems like this acceleration of talk and permits and proposals of using nuclear to power data centers so that we can address what is on the cybersecurity, cyber intelligence side that has already manifested itself. So back in January of this year, FBI Director Christopher Wray, he delivered warnings on how the People's Republic of China are posing a very broad threat, they say, across all of our critical infrastructure. And it's not just that they're posing the threat, it has already been manifested in attacks on the electrical grid, on oil and natural gas. And it's not just the PRC, it's also other cyber threat actors that are nation states like North Korea and also Russia, as well as Iran, attacks on pipelines like the Colonial Pipeline, as well as our transportation systems, and also our water treatment plants as well. So it's talking about a threat that's at the core of this. But what in the world does this have to do with AI? What does this have to do with data centers? Well, the outcome of that is going to be, and I'm quoting here what FBI Director Wray said, that there are going to be some very low blows against civilians. So this is not a military operation against our military, it's against us. So that's how it's being presented when you maybe look at different congressional testimony, or when you are in the field that I'm in, which is in cyber intelligence, and what we see on the open source side, and the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures that we see these cyber threat actors using. So this threat that has been framed by the FBI director as being real, and it has been, it is ongoing from these cyber threat actors like a Volt Typhoon. I don't know if you've ever heard this expression before, but Volt Typhoon is an actual cyber threat actor. It is considered a nation state, and it is considered a nation state that is embedded in the People's Republic of China. They are using artificial intelligence to generate millions of lines of malicious code against our critical infrastructure. So this is the connection between the drive towards artificial intelligence, adopting it, and then understanding now what you know about the water that's required to actually support this from just a power generation side. This is also connected to what you now know about the water that is required to power a data center. So coupling that with the fact that the nation states are now using artificial intelligence and their data centers that are relying on the same technology that ours would rely on to actually strike against both our IT systems as well as our industrial control systems. And they're doing this by, for example, manipulating chemical levels and water treatment plants, as well as disrupting telecommunications. Think back this summer where you name the telecommunications, whether it be Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile, have been attacked, where you could not use your own phone service. It happened to me as well as halting the distribution of some of the vital energy sources like natural gas and gasoline. Think Colonial Pipeline. And coupled with that is typically a ransomware. And these cyber threat actors are pretty sophisticated. They, a lot of times, are relying on these multi-stage attacks, or what they call double extortion, where they get into your systems and they say, okay, well, we're not going to release, or we're not going to release we're not going to release data if you give us a certain amount of money by a certain period of time. And then what they'll do is they'll say, well, if we don't, then we're going to put all of the information out on the dark web. And that could be information like your user ID, credentials, and passwords to your critical infrastructure, which sometimes are actually defaulted to default settings, which is troubling enough as it is. But I believe that a lot more and more infrastructure sectors are becoming wise to this and are being retrained so that they don't just install the systems like the SCADA systems that keep track of our water treatment, both on the wastewater and water treatment side. And they have better protocols for protecting frontline. And it's things that are just as simple as that, is the user ID and the password are actually already out and available on the internet because they're default passwords. And yes, companies still ship their systems and equipment like this. So that is hopefully changing in the future. So the question then becomes, and this is just to wrap this up, is are we really ready to fully embrace AI? It was, and maybe still is, that big, bright, shiny object that we're looking at. But then we're back to, and you've seen this slide before, we're back to, are we willing to use 6 million gallons of water per megawatt? Remember, the largest data center that is being proposed from a traditional data center hyperscaler is 1 megawatt. So for that one data center, you need 6 million gallons of water for each megawatt of energy produced. And now you have OpenAI that says it wants a data center that is 5 times as large as that, consuming 6 billion gallons of water per gigawatt. Do we really want to embrace this? So I have, let's see, I'm going to skip over this one. And then this is a fun slide because in the work that I do now, ethics and the philosophy of ethics and how we get to this point is not necessarily to answer the question of what is the solution, but where does the solution lie? And in my opinion, as we are where we are now, there are some guideposts that we can use and some guardrails. And one of them is the cybersecurity ethics principles. And these principles help us to wrap our brain around what questions are we going to, first of all, help the process slow down and answer, like, will AI data centers endanger our lives? Not only our lives in terms of people that are maybe in the shadow of a nuclear power plant, if that, and this is what they're saying, will require that level of energy to produce more and more of these data centers. Are we willing to put folks in harm's way to do that? And I'm also, and I have to be very cognizant of the fact that, yes, I mean, there are a lot of advantages to AI, these large language models that we're using to answer some questions that are essential to perhaps advancing drug discoveries, for example. I understand that is absolutely something that is a positive for this, but along the way, we do have to ask ourselves, how are we getting to that? Who's going to be held accountable for any types of accidents that might happen? And are the risks really worth it to people in the communities? And it is really, I believe, because our ability to produce a technology or to have a technology that does not use as many of the natural resources that we're requiring, that has not been answered to the extent and to the scale that is necessary to meet what feels like an immediate threat. So in cybersecurity principles, and just very briefly, and then I really want to get to the last slide because I think there's already been kind of an answer to this, where the solution lies. We look at non-malfeasance. Does it make it worse? We look at justice and we look at the explicability of it. But at the end of the day, the question becomes, are we making things worse off than they have been in the past for our public's well-being? And then I think this is where we have the answer. So currently, AWS had put in for a permit to expand their, using nuclear, expand their data centers in Pennsylvania, and they were rejected by the federal agency that manages the permitting for nuclear power plants. And here's what they said. They said that this agreement, that it would mean that there would be a significant amount of resources that are currently used for the grid as it stands now. And we're just talking about, or they were just talking about, the electricity part that would now have to be diverted to this one Amazon data center. And remember back when I told you that these data centers are co-located with each other. One data center pops up because there's cheap power and there's abundant water, and now there may possibly be nuclear available. They will start co-locating around these nuclear power plants should FERC permit them to expand. And in this instance in particular, FERC actually rejected it because they were concerned not only for whether or not there would be additional costs for distribution upgrades, because there would be, and who would bear the cost, and ultimately it would be ratepayers. But it really just means that the resources that would have to be diverted to just one data center operator. So I think we have an answer now, and that's really kind of where we stand on nuclear as it concerns data centers, and particularly the AI data centers that are for AI. So I'm going to stop my presentation and entertain questions that folks might have.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I think you, I mean, you know, what the scale of what you're talking about is pretty shocking. I mean, I like to think even in just at the smallest terms, just with AI queries versus regular queries. And I guess there's some disagreement in the literature, but there's like a 10 or 15x larger amount of energy used, electricity used for say a ChatGPT query than a standard browser search query. I think it also translates to 2/3 of a bottle of water for each. So you could just have a visual view of that as well. It seems to me that just the AI issue, it's like it's taken on arms race aspects, and you know, national security aspect, which is never good, you know, because then a whole lot of stuff gets justified, and as you say, it'll come down to you know, electricity for people or for you know, data center capacity, and same thing with water, actually, which is you know, a big part of this as well. I know that well, as far as I'm aware of, in the city of Santa Clara is a municipal utility and home to locally here a number of different data centers, leading, you know, the densest population of data centers is certainly in California, and they are talking about a 5-year wait on provisioning if you wanted to start a new data center in Santa Clara. It's like, you know, factor that in. There is a question, a couple questions have come up. One is about nuclear plant water use. And the question was whether you were referring to consumption or withdrawal. Knowing that data centers withdraw a lot, but most of it goes back into the body of water they're near. I don't know if you're talking about the cooling, evaporative cooling.
So if we're talking about the nuclear power plants, is that what the question is?
Yes.
And the water usage around that is around consumption. That's consumption, meaning that's what is needed to actually operate the nuclear power plant to produce the steam, which powers the turbines to produce the energy, and also to cool the rods.
And then the cooling itself, if it's evaporative, well, cooling the rods, but then the data center cooling is another issue as well, right. And a significant one if it's a evaporative cooling.
That's separate. That's right.
Yeah.
That was just the nuclear power plant. That is correct.
So just in the Q&A, a couple other questions that it's pretty clear that we don't have the natural resources to grow AI data centers at the current rate. Do you have the opportunity to interact with policymakers on this issue, or do you have an opinion on what regulations we should instill to keep this growth sustainable and safe?
Wow, that is a really, really smart question. So are they asking in general about interacting with policymakers?
That was one of the aspects of the question.
Okay, so I am looking now at resources through the Aspen Institute. If I need to do something that I'm not familiar with doing, I will go out and get trained. And that's what I'm recommending to whoever asked that question. The Aspen Institute has a resource now where they have policy seminars, and one of them actually was interfacing with the government on how do you interact with them and provide feedback. For example, when there's a public comment period, and how to frame it, and finding resources and opportunities to respond, I think are very important at this point, because if you are empowered with two things, or one or the other, if you're empowered with information or data that can influence the decision that's being made, whether it's in your backyard or nationally or globally, take that. And the second part is if you have, and that's from an academic standpoint. The second part is if you have a concern in your watershed over how your resources are being used. All things are local, whether you have a board of supervisors that manages things, and they're typically the ones, sometimes if you live in a Commonwealth state, then you have a board of supervisors that manage it. If you have a legislature that is contemplating policy. And I think the easiest thing to do, which is what I've done, is to be in direct contact with your congressional representatives, because they do have the local offices, as well as the ones in DC, where you can actually go to and talk to them about your concerns. And you could either, go as both a concerned citizen or also someone who is a professional, and be a consultant to them. And it takes some time and maybe some effort to identify who they are and if they're willing to talk to you, but it's definitely worth, I think, worth the effort. Is there another part to that question?
There what well, it was more about if you had an opinion on regulations to keep the growth sustainable and safe.
Yes. So the last part of that presentation was about the ethics, and that excerpt came out of an article that I had written when I mentioned the cybersecurity ethics principles. One of the things that I would propose is to have an ethics panel attached to any type of acceleration of a technology that could have deleterious effects on the public. And that panel would be composed of people who are decision makers. Like, say, for example, we would have, you're talking about Microsoft wanting to use 3 Mile Island. I would have those executives, like the corporate vice president of data centers. And I would have the people who were, part of Constellation Energy, who managed 3 Mile Island, that CEO on board, as well as the other folks who are within Microsoft that are going to be, like, for example, head of Microsoft Azure, Scott Guthrie, those people brought in, and have a panel of including residents that are there, and then go through these principles to really ask questions about risk. Companies talk about risk all the time. Why can't they talk about risk in light of natural resources that would be used, and also in light of an energy that is, from a marketing standpoint, it's deemed safe. From a marketing standpoint, it's deemed as a green energy, but there are still some real consequences to using nuclear. Even the state of North Carolina, as of today, they issue and they have a website that guides its citizens in case they are exposed to nuclear radiation as a result of a meltdown, for example. So it is still a real thing. So I would propose having these panels, lead them through workshops, and to have them talk about what are some of the risks that they should and shouldn't take. And at this point, it would serve two things. It would serve to delay any type of negative effect that would come out of the adoption of a technology that we might have, or we clearly don't have known consequences to. We're not really sure if this level of proliferation of AI data centers and then the use of potentially nuclear happens. And there is a public comment period. It should be on pretty much any type of permitting in this sense. There, it would have gotten to that point with the AWS, with the Amazon use of its expansion with nuclear in Pennsylvania, but it didn't because it was stopped with FERC. They have questions too, just from a functional standpoint. Is it real? So these processes are already in place. And my recommendation would be these panels that would allow people to just stop, to pause, to think, is this a good idea? Are we adopting and accepting a risk that from a corporate standpoint we're willing to take? And are we accepting a risk that we're going to put on and place on the public that they may or may not know about?
Well, that is certainly a brave new world that we're entering in. We're in the kind of bonus round right now, and I do just a couple quick ones. There was a question about, can data centers use closed circuit cooling systems so they reuse water, and can they use recycled water?
The answer to the question is yes to both. The data centers, and thank you so much, the data for that question, data centers that I was talking about that use that level of water or evaporative cooling or adiabatic systems. There are a number of those around the world. There are some that use mechanical cooling that have closed loop systems that do require water to start. They mix that with a coolant, and they typically flush it out every few years or so, and maybe would require, on restart, a certain number of hundreds of thousands of gallons of water to do that, and remain in a closed loop in that system. And then there's another option that you all had mentioned, absolutely. It is unfortunately less and less prevalent, which are water reuse systems that can be shared by the co-location of these different hyperscalers like a Google, a Meta, a Microsoft. And fortunately, though, there are more examples. And I worked on a project to restart a project that had been dead for about 10 years in Quincy, Washington, to design and actually construct a water reuse plant there. And it is now operating and functional. And if you want to read about it, it's called the Quincy Water Reuse Plant. And it is on EPA's website. And it's the first of its kind where Microsoft had its largest data center, one of its largest data centers headquartered there. As I mentioned before, there's a co-location of other data centers there, as well as other agricultural processors that use a lot of water. And they have 5 wells for this tiny town, and 2 of the wells are depleted, 3 are left, and then they will be compromised in the next 2 to 3 years as well if there wasn't something that was done. So this water reuse plant was built. And I recommend this be done if we are going to continue this co-location of data centers in an area. One of the policies that I would bring forth and that I would want to see on the books from a maybe a county or regional level is, if there are going to be X number of megawatts or gigawatts of data centers that are going to be located in an area, and they're there for the cheap power and for the abundant water, then they should be required to have a water reuse system that is in place and that they pay for. They figure out how to pay for it themselves, but it should not, I don't believe, come at the expense of the people that are living there, that are relying on it for regular drinking water. And that's another thing. Drinking water, I don't believe, should be used to cool data centers. And hopefully we'll see less and less of that. And then there are other options that are available from an operational standpoint within a data center to reduce the amount of water that's being used, whether it's a closed loop or an open loop system. And that requires just some creative use of making sure you understand that if you have a higher operating or server inlet temperature coming into your servers, that you would not increase the failure rate of those servers. And if you can do that, you raise the operating or the server inlet temperature, and you reduce the amount of water that you're using in those data centers. So there are a host of options that I explored as Director of Water Strategy for Microsoft. and pilot it for them as well so they can use and deploy around the world.
Great. One last, and this has to be a very quick question because we have to get on to Director Bell in just a second, who actually it's going to be interesting hearing him because of his numerous roles in California government. But the question would be, is there a kind of a metric we can take away of water use in a typical AI data center? I mean, maybe of the 1 gigawatt capacity is like what would be looking at as far as water capacity. And you don't, if you want to do the math, I welcome you to put it in the chat as far as an answer.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand the question. How much water is being used in a typical AI data center? Is that correct?
Yes, but let's talk about, hyperscale and also I guess it's a two-part question because say we talk about one of these 1 gigawatt data centers, right? Which you mentioned in the beginning. That also there might need to be power for that, that would use a lot of water as well. So maybe the answer has two parts. So maybe that can be a homework assignment for you. And thank you very much for coming on. This is not something I'm sure most people think about, and it's hard enough to even deal with like public utility commissions on water stuff, let alone FERC. And and issues like nuclear power. And yeah, at least that this really starts to get us kind of thinking about this. And certainly the cyber security issues are a whole world unto themselves as well. So thanks very much for coming on. And I'll certainly want to keep in touch because this is obviously some of the key issues of our times coming up.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you very much for your attention to the audience. And you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Great.